Alright guys, this video is going to cover the cell organelles, and we're not going to look at every possible organelle that you can find in cells, but we are going to look at some of the main ones. And hopefully you studied these in lab already, but if not, let's go over them again. So what an organelle is it's kind of just, it literally means kind of tiny organs, but they are just going to be parts within the cell that perform a specific job. And typically the reason they do a certain job is because they normally contain certain enzymes, those proteins that regulate chemical reactions. And so in your cell, we've already talked about the plasma membrane, that outer barrier. And so now we're going to look at some of the things that you can find on the inside. Now, pretty much the inside of the cell is mostly going to be the cytoplasm, which is going to be all the filler, everything that you find between the nucleus and the cell membrane. So the nucleus is this big structure here, so all of this is going to be cytoplasm, and all of that is going to be cytoplasm. So it's essentially everything in the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. Now the cytosol is specifically the fluid portion of that. So the cytoplasm includes the organelles themselves, and then the cytosol is just going to be that liquidy portion that you see, kind of the light blue in that picture there. Now some of the parts that we're going to look at, the first one is going to be the nucleus, and this is something that you'll find in eukaryotic cells, which as a human, all of our cells are eukaryotic. And so the nucleus is often referred to as the control center. It's kind of like the brain of the cell, and the reason why is because it holds the DNA. Now the DNA has our genetic instructions. It has pretty much everything that the cell needs to do all of the different functions. It has the codes for proteins and the enzymes and all of that good stuff. And so most of the time DNA is in a form called chromatin, which like in this picture you can kind of see. A lot of times I call it the noodle form because it kind of looks like a bowl of noodles, but the chromatin is a lesser condensed form, and this is when it's able to be copied and able to be read in order to make proteins. Now during division we see DNA in the chromosome form, and a lot of times when you think of DNA you think of that X shape, and that's because chromosomes kind of take on that X form. But we only see this condensed version during the division stages. So all the other times the DNA is in the chromatin form. Now what the nucleus is going to do is, because it houses the DNA, it's going to coordinate activities like growth and protein synthesis, and even the division processes themselves, metabolism, which is all those chemical reactions. And the structure of the nucleus is pretty complex. It actually has a double membrane around it. And that membrane, kind of like the plasma membrane, is going to be a phospholipid bilayer. And we call that the nuclear envelope. Sometimes it's called the nuclear membrane. It just depends on what resource you're looking at. And then inside of the nucleus, you have a very dense region called the nucleolus. And that's where ribosomes are assembled. And so that's going to be our next part. Ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis. Now when you're looking at a cell, they're one of the tiniest structures that you'll see. They're the little tiny dots, okay? So when you look at, I'm going to go back to that first cell, and in this picture it's all those little black dots that you see in the background. So ribosomes are pretty tiny. They are not membrane structures. A lot of the organelles are membranes, but in the case of ribosomes, they're not membrane bound. They pretty much have RNA and protein as their structure, okay? That's what they're made up of. Our RNA is called ribosomal RNA, and it's that joined up with some proteins, and that gives us these basic structures of the ribosome, the large subunit and the small subunit. Now the ribosomes themselves can be found kind of hanging out in the cytoplasm. We call those free ribosomes, or they could be attached to a membrane known as the rough ER. And the reason that we call the rough ER rough is because of those bumpy ribosomes that are on it. Now the ER stands for endoplasmic reticulum, and in general what that is it's a big wavy network of membranes. It's kind of outside of the nucleus, and you can see that it's very long and folded, and it's kind of a combination of membrane tubes and membrane sacs. And so there's actually two types. We have the rough ER, which once again is rough because of the ribosomes, and because those ribosomes are attached and they are the site of protein synthesis, the rough ER is also going to be a site of protein synthesis. And then once those proteins are made, the rough ER can kind of help to fold and move those proteins along, package them. Now the smooth ER has a completely different function, okay? It's smooth because it doesn't have the bumpy ribosomes. It also doesn't have the protein functions because there's no ribosome. So instead what it does is it breaks down toxins, and then it also helps move lipids around. So it's kind of like this big wavy membrane highway. We got proteins being made over here, we have lipids being transported over here. And then the next step is usually going to be the Golgi apparatus. Sometimes this is called Golgi bodies, or sometimes it's called the Golgi complex. But once again, we have a big membrane-bound kind of complex of flattened sacs. And a lot of times I like to refer to this as the UPS of the cell. And the reason we call it that sometimes is because it literally receives the proteins from the ER and the cytoplasm. It processes those proteins, kind of tags them, it packages them up into these little vesicles, okay, and then it's going to ship it off wherever it needs to go in the cell. So it's kind of like a postal service or the UPS. So it receives those proteins from the ER, and then it's going to package, process, and distribute them to wherever it needs to go. Our next organelle is a lysosome, and lysosomes kind of come from the word lys, which means to break or burst open. And so what lysosomes do is they break down materials because they contain digestive enzymes. So they're kind of our digestion organelle. So in the cell, you're going to have old organelles that aren't functioning properly anymore, and they're going to be taken in by these membrane-bound sacs, and essentially they're going to be digested into smaller components. So a lot of times they're kind of like the cleanup crew of the cell. And then the last organelle that we're going to talk about in this lesson is the mighty mitochondria. And most people are familiar with the mitochondria, but what we need to know about mitochondria is that it is our energy producer, okay? It is the site of cellular respiration, which is this chemical reaction right down here. And what's important about it is we're getting this ATP energy. So it's in the mitochondria that we take those sugars that we eat, and in the presence of oxygen, we break them down, and from that process, we generate ATP, which is energy for our cells. So they're kind of a special organelle. They have double membrane, kind of like the nucleus. They have their own DNA and their own ribosomes. And I know a lot of people know it as the powerhouse, but for this class, we need to know more than that. We do need to know that it's the site of cellular respiration, and it produces energy in the form of ATP for our cells. And so there's just kind of a general overall summary. Now there are definitely more parts in a cell. There are things like vacuoles and cytoskeleton, but these are the ones that you need to know, probably the most important ones. And that is going to wrap up Objective 3.